Modern empires often leave a trail of blood and destruction. The lives of ordinary people, those the writer John Pilger calls the unpeople, are often sacrificed in the quest for resources, money and power. In the Middle East, perhaps more than anywhere, the empire and resistance to it create reverberations all over the world. In distant places like Australia, some see through the ideological smokescreen and cry out and protest against the bloody faces flashed across their screens. Phil Monsour, an Australian songwriter of Lebanese descent, has often added his voice to the opposition to wars in empire. In 2008, he released a CD entitled The Empire's New Clothes, with many songs about occupation, resistance and hope. He has used his music to move, organise and bring people together. He gives voice to untold stories and has helped raise money for the forgotten victims of empire. In the tradition of artists of conscience, Phil Monsour has made the choice of active solidarity over sympathy or silence.
In 2006, when the Israeli military were pummeling Lebanon and killing many people and destroying large amounts of the infrastructure all across the country. Sitting here in Australia and watching that and having a fairly large extended family sort of over there and living through that experience, I was prompted to try and make some sort of statement about it.
Destruct, destroy, demolish, bulldoze, bully, clear, flatten, kill, murder, slaughter, slay, butcher, assassinate, etc. These are words that do describe Israel.
If you've seen what I've seen coming from living in Australia all my life and going into Palestine, occupied Palestine, seeing the change, seeing the war, seeing the reality of it. You know, the siege on Gaza, the attack on Gaza.
Why we can't live together? Why have to make an exclusive Israel exclusive area for the Jews? Who's got the right to live in that country? The person who born there, Jeff? Or the person who born in Manhattan, New York, or Australia, or Bondi? Or in America to go there and get free land and live there?
All the legality is there. All the laws are there. The justice is there on the side of the Palestinian people. But what we are lacking is the confidence from leaders around the world to take a position that supports a just resolution of this conflict.
But the ongoing thing is the checkpoints, the Israeli-only roads, the Israeli-only schools, the 8-metre wall that snakes through all of Palestine.
It's really not that hard. There are a few fundamentals that, if people actually respect the fundamental rights, a lot of the situation would be solved. It's
apartheidism, it's racism, it's Nazism, all combined in one in the 21st century, in the year 2009, and it's still prevalent there.
On this sad morning, there are no words to speak. The sun itself is weeping for the broken bodies in the rubble. In the soft light of the moon, the war machine it roared over the quiet breathing, restless dreams of sleeping children. Oh, we hear
the response of the Australian government was, once again linked to this whole Middle East agenda and Middle East policy that most Western governments fall into.
All we hear are the lies and the silence. All we hear are the lies and the silence.
Statements about politicians and knowing it bear no real semblance to what was actually happening and why it was happening. And so trying to make some sort of statement about those lies, but then the other aspect of their response was to avoid saying anything at all and just sitting back and letting these events occur without raising any voice of resistance or any voice of opposition.
Silence.
Americans talking about powers that arm terrorists. What they're really saying is that they're the biggest sponsors of terrorism in the world. And I think we need to explain to people that when we watch this media, you listen to their words and you just swap it round and you can understand when they describe terrorism, what they actually are is terrorists, and they're projecting on to us and to the people of the Middle East what they really are.
May my strength help move the rubble, and with each stone rebuild the bridges. Give me some of that load, let me carry it with me, and give me a song to sing until all people are free. Let me help you.
In that period, I just finished sort of fairly intensive work with a touring band that was travelling to Europe and fairly regularly and doing shows over there, and coming back mixed with the events that occurred in Australia and around the world, I felt it was time to sort of explore the issue of identity in the music and why it was that I had written and I was writing certain sorts of songs and trying to pull those all together. So the concerts were really the beginning of that. So that was when I deliberately selected a set of songs that were all somehow interlinked and around a theme, and started performing those, and ultimately that led to the stage of recording those as well. And as that happened, the events kept unfolding, and new events would come online that would make it even more imperative or significant. And when you think about these events, really, there's a long string of them relating to the Middle East. So we had the invasion of Iraq, we had the ongoing conflict in Palestine, the invasion and destruction of Lebanon in 2006, the recent war on Gaza, and then you intermix that with events in Australia like the Cronulla riots, and also a lot of Australia's anti-refugee policy was largely directed at people from the Middle East, and all these issues sort of intermingled into, it seemed to me, to be a good time and a significant thing to do, to pull these songs together and make some sort of statement as powerfully as I could. Being one of the people in countries like Australia that protested and opposed the imminent invasion of Iraq, it seemed to me that we were these sort of voices that were really speaking out against an already predetermined agenda, and even though the opposition seemed significant, in places like Brisbane we witnessed probably the largest protest march in the history of the city, none of that meant anything, and we were just these sort of voices that were saying, hang on, this is what they're saying it's about is not what it's about, but never being listened to, and the events rolled on, and the terrible tragedy unfolded.
It's happening again, against the will of ordinary people who say thou shalt not kill. I can't see the empire's new clothes. I can't see the empire wearing new clothes.
So it was a fairly angry statement to say, as the fairy tale talks about, a little voice saying, the emperor's naked, but no one was listening.
People graves. I can't see the empire's new clothes. I can't see the empire
the Empire's New Clothes project, there was one theme that was central to it, and that was the idea that Palestinians had the right to return to their homes and their villages.
We have lived in these places for many, many years, but these places, they will never be our home. For the hope that lives in all people lives in us still. One day we will go home. We will go home. We will go home. One day we will go.
The Israel-Palestine conflict is something that's been going on basically since the end of World War I. It's one of the longest running conflicts in the modern era. Palestine for over 60 years now has been under a brutal Israeli military occupation. A lot of people focus on what happened in 1967 when Israel took over the territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But in fact, the real occupation of Palestine began a long time before that. It began really in 1947 with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. From November 1947, about 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes and land. In the 6 months prior to the declaration of the State of Israel, there were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were displaced, at least 35 massacres that took place during that time. There were over 500 villages destroyed, and there were at least a dozen towns that were completely emptied of their inhabitants.
In 40
Yeah.
I remember the mayor of the village. He used to come up and he said, "Did you hear what happened in Deir Yassin?" I tell my grandfather, you know, Deir Yassin is a famous 250, 260 people actually been murdered. And they said, if you don't move, we better move. And every time the Jews come up and ask us to move, my father and grandfather stand in front, my mother was young, we refused to move. They go out, leave us for a week, they come back again and harass us and gas.
Now the Palestine issue is one where there is a large number of, in fact the largest refugee population in the world trying to get back. Those 800,000 Palestinians that were originally driven out, their descendants now number in the millions. Between 4 and 7 million. And so one of the major issues of this conflict is the right of return of the Palestinian refugees that's recognised by the United Nations, including the Security Council.
We will go home. We will go home. We will go.
We never really spoke about it. It was never, because my mother never knew anything about Palestine. She came from and I'll give you the background just so you can see where we led up to. She came from a village or a town. It doesn't exist anymore. It's called Zananuka. On her passport, an Australian passport, it says Zananuka. But if you look that up, you're not going to find it. It's near Tel Aviv. It was wiped off the face of the map. The Israelis wiped it out, as they did many other towns and villages.
What terrified my family, I think, because my father, he doesn't want to use it. He wanted to defend us. Just because my mother, he wouldn't any harm to my mother and us. He said, we better go. So they forced us, and they used to come up, and we heard about the Yassin. They were terrified of us and terrified they're going to kill us too, you see. They were very vigilant.
We will go home. We will go home.
When you put it in that context, it's about identity, it's about a country, it's about a history, it's about family, and it's all those things. And even though we just use a simple term like home, in the context of what it's actually talking about, it's so much bigger and so much more powerful. And I guess that song was just an attempt to give expression to that, and that's why it uses so many voices, and it's largely a refrain and a song of hope like that.
Well, you can take a chance, leave it all behind. You can tell the judge you're giving up your life of crime.
But we live in a time where we've been sold that, consume, happiness is defined by what we own, and there's a deliberate culture of ignoring. People don't want to be troubled by the uncomfortableness of perhaps the fact that their affluence has a direct impact on people somewhere else.
Hanging your head in collective guilt in this world full of collective punishment, you century dawn.
And also the irony of being at a time where there's more information around than there's ever been, and there's easier access to a whole swag of information that we couldn't have accessed in the past so simply. But living in a time where there seems to be more ignorance, and it's almost as if the more information, the less people actually know about things.
Weeds are growing and you're aging fast, making every little bit of daylight lost. You got a video phone, color coordinated matching hair. You got friends tattooed everywhere and you silicon soul. Now the guns are stopped and the fighting is over. We crawl out of our shelter and face another day. And sometimes we bury our dead or bandage our wounds, and we look to the sky and we wonder when this is all going to end.
And in terms of the Palestinian narrative, it's been so many decades now that they have been essentially powerless in taking any sort of control of their experience and their lives and their future.
Well, my father tells a story. He says he can remember as a little boy of 6 when we were driven from our home, and he clung to his grandmother's dress as they loaded them onto the trucks and drove them to the border of a land we still call home. And how can we go?
You know that at any time, you know, one of your uncles or your aunties or your cousins is going to get locked up. They're going to get arrested without charge. They're going to be shot. Their house is going to be demolished. They're going to turn off the electricity. They probably haven't had electricity for the last couple of days because Israel just decides to turn off the electricity on the village of 20,000 people. And once you've lived there and you've seen that, even though I went there as a holiday, not so much a holiday really to visit, and I experienced the life from day to day of a Palestinian living there with a so-called Palestinian identification card and the restraints that is associated with having that card in life generally, not just travel. There's mixed emotions. One is of frustration to the extent where you can't do anything, where it boils up inside you, knowing that this happens in the 21st century.
We just went on, and eventually we left in July, I believe, not in May. We left actually maybe in the summer. It was a hot summer when we left Pakistan. And we had to just take a few things, food, belonging, and walk to Kalkilia. And people died sick and tired along the road. I remember people falling over, people got trucks and horses. We didn't have my truck. My grandfather, he took it for himself. And his stepson from his second wife, because he married another wife, another child, and he got to know the mayor of Kalkilia. And he went directly to the mayor of Kalkilia, and he had no room for my father. So we ended up living in an olive grove on a tree. And just enough belonging. We left the furniture, even the money. He has money, stacks of money. He never took his money with him. He just took enough money to us because we never thought we'd stay that long.
What tomorrow will bring, 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 what tomorrow will bring.
I always remember saying to us, I said, "Dad, where are we going?" He said, "Oh, Dad, come further." I said, "Oh, we're just going for a while here in this village and we'll come back." That's what I thought. I never thought, I don't know about the big picture of the whole thing. As a boy, I said, we're going to that village, walking, but I felt fear there. I saw my parents quite sad.
Where the light shines through the doorway, the sunlight in your mother's hair, and the view through that window, it has changed. That old olive tree is no longer there, and the people who live here now look at us with fear and pity.
It's a very common story now for Palestinians, not just from distant places, but within Palestine itself and from nearby countries, to seek out their old houses and their old villages and their old farms and have a bit of a look when they get an opportunity. And he returned and had the experience of, finding the house and knocking on the door and very uncomfortably sitting in the dining room of that house, drinking with the people that live there now. And all the time he had that symbol in his pocket, that key in his pocket, and he'd carried it, he'd been given it. His parents had given it to him, and ultimately one day he'd pass that on, and those keys, there must be hundreds of thousands of those keys, and they're the symbol of the fact that people haven't given up their right to return.
On my exile all these years, and I take that old key from my pocket, and I leave it on the table by the door. I step out there and close the door behind me. You are my spirit, you are my heart.
My Spirit is a song that was actually probably written when I was in Lebanon and meeting my family and spending time with many members of the family who I'd never met before, and my grandmother, who I only really met 2 times in my life. And it was watching her play with my younger cousins that lived near to her, and listening to her speak to them, and one of the Arabic phrases that she used when she spoke to them, and that she used quite often. And it turned into a song that was trying to take some of the poetry of the Arabic language and see if I could express it in an English version of the song.
You are my eyes, you are my love. Are hungry and the bellies are empty and the prisons are full, and it's an idea that is a crime. When the time is coming and the waiting is over,
that we will not be silent in the face of the silence of the media, and in the face of the complicity of the Australian politicians who that they are not going to stop us from saying that Israel's policies towards the Palestinians are nothing short of genocide, and have been exactly that way since 1948 and the establishment of Israel.
Looking at the institutions and politics of countries like Australia, the real hope for concrete and meaningful expressions of solidarity, they're not really going to come from the governments at the moment, and I think the unions represent the most sort of powerful and significant institution that we have that's able to express, for ordinary people in Australia to express solidarity with ordinary people in other countries.
The dock workers in South Africa actually showed us what could be done. In February this year, dock workers belonging to the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union refused to offload ships, the ship, the Diana Russ, which is a ship carrying Israeli goods to South Africa. Now they did this in solidarity with the Palestinians.
On the road to victory, and guns are not enough.
Earlier this year, we saw the Irish, Scottish and South African Trade Union Congresses all call for a boycott against Israel.
So that was part of our, a very clear idea that if we were going to raise money and we were going to send it somewhere, that it would be more than just a concept of aid, sending money to people, but it was also about the organisations interacting as well. But trade unionists in Australia had links with ordinary people and workers in other countries, and in Palestine and occupied Palestine and Lebanon.
And the water flows from a broken pipe in the silence, sets the dust. A small child crouches on the road, doing what we all must, and it's a long way.
With countries like Lebanon, it seems we've had decades and decades of a climate where nothing seems to settle, and if it does feel like it's settled, it quickly evaporates. That song proved itself to be quite true for the decades long that it's been alive, and peace has always been a long way away for a number of generations.
It's almost ancient. Look at its heart. See the scars and the blood. If you sit and you listen, you can hear some people praying, and it's a long way on the face of it. It's such a long way on the face of it.
There are things that people will not accept, and resistance will continue. They resist with determination and the hope that at some point they will achieve or receive justice, and that's inspiring. To see that from young people and see that from older people that still have that hope that justice is coming, and that we can do things that make things better and can change the course of history.
The shadows are lifting from over my heart. The fires are burning deep in my soul. Now the hiding is over. Step into the sun for tomorrow and change. It will come.
It's very simple. The ideal Palestine would be for the children to go to school 5 days a week like we do here, but they're not allowed to do that because Israel blocked the roads, or they'll block their schools, or they'll close down the schools. I think the ideal Palestine would be for their students to go to university unimpeded, to have, to have access to education as we do here.
We also have the issue of settlements, Israeli settlements on Palestinian land, another issue that has been clearly decided by the UN Security Council. But again, it requires the political will to be able to bring this situation to a just resolution.
The freedom to drive down a road without being stopped because you're Palestinian, to be refused to go down that road because you're Palestinian.
When I see the day that Americans stop sending the weapons to Israel, I think that's the day that we'll see something change.
I think the idea of Palestine, my grandfather, to be able to go see Jerusalem like he did prior to 1948. I think the ideal Palestine would be for our Christian neighbours to go see the Church of Nativity, the Holy Sepulchre.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. There are so many.
And then of course there's the question of Jerusalem, a city that's holy to not only Jews but also to Muslims and Christians, a city that really should belong to all three faiths, a city that should be accessible to people globally. But this city is under an illegal Israeli occupation. I say illegal because that is how it's been declared by the UN Security Council.
All my grandparents, both of them, died from broken-hearted. They always would go home. I remember my grandfather used to go up the mountain and look at Palestine. He always tell me, one day we go home. I am optimistic by nature. I will never lose that hope, John.
I've seen the promised land, and I have no fear, and I have no fear, and I have no
Thank you for coming along and thanks for listening.
The movement against apartheid Israel has become an irresistible force. They said, we are proud to stand with the millions of people around the world who say enough is enough. They are doing what we asked them to do when we faced the apartheid regime in our own country. The union also said that COSATU, that's the Trade Union Congress, calls on all people of conscience to join us in boycotting Israeli products and institutions until a just, democratic state with equal rights for all comes into existence in Palestine.